Thank you for all coming and having this space. And it's not often that I get opportunities to talk to people about things like this, at least when they're welcoming. I'm usually like, hey, you better listen to this. But thank you much for this opportunity. I think it's very important given the particular historical context. So let's get into that context a little bit. So we are right now at what I think to be the perceived height of the Black Lives Matter movement. It's kind of hard to predict because we don't know what it's going to look like in a couple years, if this is the height or actually building up to a height. But we are in the height right now of the Black Lives Matter movement. And the Black Lives Matter movement is remarkable for a number of reasons. One, it gives us a framework to think about violence happening to the Black community. Sort of really teasing out this idea of state violence, particularly looking at law enforcement and the way that law enforcement interacts or is violent toward the Black communities, and also looks at gendered violence, right? So thinking not only about how police are killing Black people, but how queer folks and women folks and other folks are being killed in the Black community. Given this framework and also my own lived experience as a queer person, a female assigned person, a gay person, as a Black person, to me it seemed very natural to understand the intersection of the two. So not only just to talk about law enforcement over here, or just to talk about queer identity or gendered violence over here, but really how do they interconnect and what is the consequence if we don't get one or the other correct? So I had several opportunities to go down to Ferguson, sort of where the Black Lives Matter movement took a different shape or a different life. Though it originally started around the time of Trayvon Martin, like folks really started organizing and using that framework, it sort of went to another height when Ferguson took place in the Urban Rebellion. So when I got a chance to go down there a couple times, 4 times, it was clear that there were queer folks of color, queer Black people in particular, who were fighting adamantly, who were at the front lines, who were moving a lot of this work. It was also clear that there was not, even nationally we still struggle with this, there was not a lot of recognition of that queer leadership. And what was also clear to me is the particular ways that queer people are impacted by state violence. And in this case, law enforcement or police violence, that wasn't really being articulated in a way that people across the movement were really getting. So I came back to Madison, and you know, Madison is perceived to have these liberal politics. I'm like, you know what? This group of folks is gonna get it. So I come back, I'm like, yeah, we just came from Ferguson. The call from Ferguson was, if you want to be really in solidarity with us, you need to go back to your own community and do it. So it's great if you come down and proclaim that Black Lives Matter, but how are you gonna go back to Madison or Philadelphia or whatever place you're from and make sure or demand that Black Lives Matter? So we get back, and Freedom Inc. is organizing. Then we link up with other folks in YGB forums, and we're like, Black Lives Matter. And naturally, the queer Black people came to the forefront of the movement. We're fighting adamantly. But what I did not see was an influx of white middle-class queer folk coming into the movement. Now, to me, I was a bit disappointed. I said, well, what's going to happen here has obvious implications, at least as I think, to the queer community. And so that's what I want to talk about tonight. What happens if queer, middle class, or white folks sit back and sit this one out? What happens if we don't, at this moment, take seriously the call of Black Lives Matter and what that justice work looked like for our community? And so I sort of think about it right now, or just a second ago, a paper was handed out that sort of works through these ideas that I'm going to talk through tonight. So I'm going to kind of briefly offer four ways that we can think about what's the impact of the Black Lives Matter movement, or moreover, if we don't fight for Black lives, what that means for the queer movement in general. So the first is a true human rights approach. Often enough, we as queer folks take up a human rights ideology or a framework when we talk about what is ours or what we deserve, right? We got the whole human rights campaign, right? When we think of marriage equality, many people argue with whether or not they actually have done any political research on what human rights laws are or human rights mechanism. But as people, right, we believe deep-seatedly as people that we have the right to have the family that we choose. As people, we believe that we have the right to love whoever, to have as many kids or no kids, to be whoever it is that we are, and seek meaningful or gainful employment, not be forced out of community, not be forced out of housing, and a whole host of other issues that impact our community because we are human, right? So we use a human rights approach or human rights framework. The beauty about a human rights framework is that it is non-competitive, right? So if we are fighting for human rights, my human rights or me getting human rights is not going to compete with your ability to get human rights or have human rights. So if you have a human right to housing, I have a human right to water, right, which we all do. You can get housing and I can get water. There is no competition, right? We believe in a basic system because we're human, we are allowed to have basic things. And because it's non-competitive, it's allowed to be multi-issue. We're able to talk about a broad scope of issues and say that we deserve them all and they're all our rights. If we truly believe that as a queer community, if we truly believe that we have these rights by mere fact that we are human, then that must also be true for Black people. If we fight for human rights, if we're seriously going to be fighting for human rights, we have to fight for human rights for all people. Otherwise, we actually are not fighting for human rights because we have entered back into a competitive way of seeing the world, and we have taken back our very strong intersectional approach for how to do community building. So we hear, if we look at the Matthew Shepard case, right? Sort of at our very basic, he didn't deserve that. People don't deserve that, right? That was the sort of language we were using to defend Matthew Shepard. He didn't deserve that. We didn't deserve that. People don't deserve that. People don't deserve to be mistreated. If that is true for Matthew Shepard, that Matthew Shepard, by argument of human rights, has the right to walk down the street via violence, is that not true of Trayvon Martin? Is that not true of Trayvon Martin? Yes. So if we take seriously, this is a charge to all of us who have fought adamantly for gay marriage and a host of other things under this human rights umbrella, or who have donated to human rights campaigns or using the language. If we are serious about it, then we have to be not only for Matthew Shepard, but fundamentally, principally, we also have to be for Trayvon Martin. If we are fighting for people to walk down the street, that has to be true for both of them. So that's the first way I think we should think about it. That is an intersecting point of human rights. There's kind of a second way that we should think about why the queer community needs to be behind and pushing for Black Lives Matter and diametrically opposed to the murders that we've been seeing recently in the news is because we as queer people, we are the defenders of gender diversity. Yes. We are the people who say, no way, no how should a person be ridiculed, mocked, beaten, or killed for the ways that they present their genders. Whether or not it's articulated in the media or even, to the person you sit next to, whether or not it is said or stated, many of the Black men who have been murdered were murdered for their perceived hypermasculinity. If we as a queer... Thank you. Yeah. I know, happy birthday. We as queer people should jump back, should be startled, should be offended deeply at the idea of somebody being murdered for their perceived or for their gender presentation, for their presentation of their masculinity. And to be clear, right, if you think about me and you believe in M and you want to fight for M's right to present M's gender the way that I want to, my gender presentation is far more similar to Michael Brown than it is Ellen DeGeneres, right? So thank you. It's very like the crowd, I appreciate it. So let's imagine that I could somehow create a spectrum where on one side I could linearly represent hypermasculinity, and on this side I could represent a person being effeminate or hypo-masculine. So on this side I have Michael Brown or somebody, or however the media is talking about Michael Brown, and on this side I have the artist formerly known as Prince. Right? You two, can you picture those both? So I argue that the state is violent to both of those people. Granted, they are on opposite ends of the spectrum, but it is the exact same spectrum of masculinity that they're on. And if the state is violent to them because of their perceived masculinity or gender presentation, that is a direct affront to how we understand ourselves as queer people. Whether or not he identified, or we don't even know how he identified, right? And so we need to be against any power structure, any system, any policies, any bodies, any institutions that would act out violence onto a person because of how they perceive their gender presentation, right? So, and to be clear, this is also racialized, right? And that's another challenge here, right? So this is also a racialized gender performance. And in fact, there's nothing threatening about Michael Brown to me. He looks like a black boy. That's what a lot of black boys look like, right? That's how I understand a lot of black masculinity, right? There was nothing threatening about him to me. Now, to some people, to white people, right, that's the racialization of that gender. But they're both interacting with one another. Same thing that we see with Tamir Rice, right? A 12-year-old boy. But the way that he was described was superhuman or subhuman, or superhuman, depending on how you see it, and his masculinity, therefore making him not a victim. In our community, right, if we're not used to thinking about gender that way, the ways that we've seen gender be attacked is for our gender performances being called perverted, right? So many of us who transcend gender binaries, particularly folks who are male assigned, who are trans feminine, often get called perverted, often get called a lot of terrible names, accused of a lot of terrible things, just based on their gender performance and gender presentation. And because of their gender performance or gender presentation, society agrees, or society says it's okay that they be the receivers of that violence. That same violence that happens there is connected to the violence that happens to Michael Brown, that happens to Eric Garner, this perception of gender that is viewed as threatening and therefore warranting violence or murder by the state. Thank you. So to put it briefly, as queer folks, if we stand in defense of drag, we have to stand in defense of SAG. Thank you. Such a good crowd. We got all night. The third point I make, which is, has been made several times, is that black people are queer people and queer people are black people, right? We all have multiple identities. We all have race, we all have class, gender, and a host of other identities. If we are really a community that always talks about being for a person's full self, being able to show up fully human, to be able to be loved fully human, then we have to not only think about a person's gender or sexuality, but we also have to think about a person's race. And in fact, the reason why we don't see as many queer black people being talked about in mainstream spaces when we talk about queer violence is because we haven't done our work, which is to also talk about people's race. So what you see is that the Matthew Shepherds get talked about and not the CeCe McDonald's, or not the Monica Robertsons and a host of other folks whose names we may not even know because they're queer and black. And I believe that in this room and in this city, we are a community that cares for all queer people. There is no way that we can fight for queer black people without fighting for black liberation. That is the truth of this country, given the historical context of racism. It is true that you cannot, and in fact, a quick story. So when I was in Ferguson, and we were marching and doing this whole, I'm not exactly sure what I was doing there. I was just kind of there. Everybody else was very active. But I was there pretending to be active in this moment because I had stopped to overhear a conversation. And people were talking about just other people whose names they were going to begin to put into chants and talk about, like, Michael Brown, Trayvon Martin, and there was this whole host of names, majority of them black cisgender men who are perceived or actually or touted as being heterosexual. And somebody was like, well, what about this person? What about this person? What about this person? And they were queer people, queer black people in particular, trans black people in particular. And a lot of people were like, we didn't even know about that. We didn't hear about that. So then it began to be a conversation about, well, why don't you know? Why weren't these in stories? Why weren't these And somebody had shared. We tried to get it put in like some local queer whatever thing, and they didn't take it because they said that this wasn't as important to some of the other forms of violence or some of the other white or mainstream issues in that article. If we don't take seriously Black liberation, that continues to happen. If we don't look at issues impacting the Black community, issues that are queer issues, because Black people are queer, we will silence Black queer people and we would never be able to hold them in our movement. As a Black queer person, I can tell you, police violence is a queer issue. Right? Police violence is a queer issue. Right? But people have to also hold my identity as being queer and Black. Right? I'm gay, my gay is Black. Right? My gay is Black. Right? Yeah, right on. So we have to see the intersections of race and queerness, and we have to fight for the wholeness of people. And if we don't, even if you're Black, if you're not Black, or if you're white in this case, you might say, well, you know, whatever, I'm gonna leave out the race piece. Inevitably, if there is oppression of any queer person, it would ultimately come to you. So if you think you can get away with not talking Black liberation or not dealing particularly with the uniquenesses of the Black queer community, what happens there to the most vulnerable would ultimately impact and happen to you. So it would actually behoove you to stop it from even happening to your community. And it is already happening, but not in the same numbers. And so the fourth way we can think about why the killing of unarmed Black people is a queer issue is because police violence is not only racial, it is also patriarchal. Patriarchy, heteropatriarchy, is the enemy of queer justice. It is heteropatriarchy that says that we don't have the right to live and call our bodies and name our bodies and do whatever to our bodies we choose in terms of presentation, gender identity, and a host of other issues. And it is heteropatriarchy that says we cannot have a diverse choice of partners. It is heteropatriarchy that says there's actually gender boxes and it needs to be in a man and a woman and they need to behave like this and look like this. That same patriarchy exists not only in community or interpersonally, but it also exists structurally and systematically in policing. The same system of enslavement, which a lot of policing practices, history of policing comes from, is racial. That same system was also patriarchal. And it is patriarchal violence that is rooted in domination. And it is patriarchal violence that if there are quote unquote perceived threats, in addition to racial violence, it does this too, but if there are perceived threats, acts in a way that needs to kill or make that person or that idea or body submit. And so what we see happening is in police, I bet as a movement, if we took more seriously the root or how patriarchy is a huge part of queer violence, we'd actually make a movement that was more expansive in two ways. One, if we looked at patriarchal or police violence as patriarchal violence, we would do better to talk about the ways unique genders were impacted by that patriarchal violence. So we would have a movement that not only talked about men who are being killed by police, we would be talking about women who are killed by police, trans folks, and other folks of different genders who are killed by police, because our analysis would sophisticate to understand this heteropatriarchy that we need to be looking at and understanding the unique ways that those bodies are impacted. In addition to expanding our movement to include the different genders, we would also expand it to be able to talk about violence differently. Too often when we think about police violence and state violence, we only think of shooting or stabbing or choking somebody to death as being the act of violence that we should care about, which is often considered masculine ways of engaging in combat, right? If we look at heteropatriarchy or patriarchy in general, we would have a movement that was sophisticated enough to talk about rape and sexual assault and a host of other forms of violence that often get viewed as secondary because they are not considered masculine forms of violence. Patriarchy, heteropatriarchy, is a direct affront to queer justice. Patriarchy, heteropatriarchy, is embedded in policing practices. This idea that there needs to be a dominant and a submissive. The idea that if you do not behave in a particular box set up by patriarchy, that you are subject to violence, rape, shootings, beatings, and killings. So when I was thinking about this, I was thinking about like these natural connections that were happening for me in the fight, and also how I saw what was happening in the Black Lives Matter movement. I went back to read some Black queer writers. So I always get inspired by like the Angela Davises, the Alice Walkers, and a host of other issues. And as I was reading it, I came across this James Baldwin quote, and it's written on the paper, but it says, and he wrote this, James Baldwin wrote this to Angela Davis as she was incarcerated. He said, "If we know, then we must fight for your life as though it were our own, which it is, and render impassable with our bodies the corridor to the gas chamber. For if they take you in the morning, they will be coming for us that night." If we, as a queer community, do not take seriously the Black Lives Matter movement or Black liberation movement and understand the ways that the police and the policing state is violent toward Black people, it will do the same thing to us. Thank you.